you very much. My name is Stefan. I'm just excited that everybody else will be here. And I will take the next 30 minutes to talk about model of the energy. The motivation of this project is similar to what we've had a couple of times before today. We're substituting away from fossil fuels in the fight against climate change. But how easy, how costly it's going to be, how fast we can do this is still unknown. And I do apologize for equation number 1 on slide 1, but I think it's going to be useful to just put the benchmark here against which I'm going to compare my model. So existing approaches focus typically on long-run outcomes, but climate change is a matter of centuries and so on. And reduce the energy transition, if you want, to 1 CS per annum. So I define energy input in the economy, E as some bundle of EF, which are fossil, and EG, which are green energy. And then the sigma, again, the associative substitution, is going to define how easily we can substitute between these two. This is prone to a couple of mistakes. So firstly, you could fix it as a substitution, which is too low, and it's going to overestimate long-run costs, because as I'm going to show in a bit, the economy is more flexible in the long run. It can adjust price signals and so on. So it's going to be easier over a longer time horizon to substitute away than it's going to be on some low time. So that's the second mistake. So if you fix a very high distance of substitution right away, you're assuming that it's super easy even from this year to next year to substitute away from oil and so on. And this is going to overestimate the short-run costs, because the economy is very dependent on fossil fuels as is today, and on a yearly basis, which will be the short run that I'm going to talk about, it is quite difficult to do this substitution. So kind of bridging these two things, so acknowledging it's difficult in the short run, but easy in the long run, is key to evaluate these energy transitions, and also related policies. To be a bit more precise, I'm going to try to answer 3 research questions in this paper. Firstly, what are the main determinants of fossil fuels in the economy? It's going to sound a bit trivial, but I'll show that my approach is a bit different. So I'm going to build a new model and use production. How easily is it to substitute away, as I alluded to before? I'm trying to bridge the short run, the long run, and substitutability through a chain of correct technical change. And if I have time, I'll also talk about capacity building electricity generation. And then I'm going to use this model and try to evaluate some policies. In particular, I'm going to evaluate the net zero by 2050 policy, have a quantitative model, and then see what are the costs to transition to net zero by 2050, and what is the optimal path of emissions of fossil fuels that we should do. Okay, let me skip the later literature. First of all, it's incomplete because I haven't included all the data that we had today. And this is just for time. So let me first give you background and the main model structure that I'm going to use today. So what you see on the left here is, this is the graph from the EIA, the Energy Information Administration in the US. It's going to show US energy consumption in the year 2019. On the left are the so-called primary energy sources, which are the 3 fossil fuels: petroleum, natural gas, and coal. And you have renewable energy and nuclear as a non-fossil energy. And I've shown before, so typically this is taken as energy input into the production and final output production. And so the sigma that I've shown before would be, for example, between petroleum and renewables. But if you look at it, as it is depicted here, you have these primary energy sources are not necessarily the energy types that are being used in final output production. For example, natural gas can be used directly in the chemical industry and so on, or natural gas is first transformed into electricity, and the electricity is the energy type that we're using for in particular, renewable energy, I mean, sunlight, wind, water flow is never a direct input in final production, but has to be transformed into electricity first to then be used. There are some arrows going directly to these sectors, but it's mostly biomass, wood, and waste, which is not going to be renewable energy over time. Okay, so if we think about energy transition, it's not really between oil and renewables, but it is in the final introduction between fossil fuels and electricity. Right? So we first want to replace fossil fuels with electricity, and secondly, we want to make sure that this electricity is actually produced from renewable resources. So the energy transition is actually a two-stage process. And that's what I'm trying to take kind of electricity in this one. Extremely dry marks. So I'm going to show now the basic model structure. I'm going to talk about all these end-use sectors. In particular, we're going to be talk about aggregate level. So we have final output, which is going to be produced by three input factors. Firstly, capital labor, as standard. And thirdly, these energy services. And contrary to the literature, as I said before, for me, these energy services are going to be a bundle of electricity and fossil resource. Another question is, so how is electricity produced? Electricity can be produced in two ways. First, you can have fossil capital, which are coal-powered capital power plants, which need to be combined with the fossil resource, right? So you can't just have the capital there, you need fuel with coal and gas to produce electricity. And secondly, you can produce electricity from green capital, so solar panels, wind turbines, and so on. And again, you need a resource to do this. So these are going to be renewable resources. So sunlight, so the solar panel needs sunlight to operate. The wind turbines need wind, and so on. And then, so this whole right-hand side is going to be kind of the innovation in this project. And then you need kind of to close the model, you need a supply side. So the household is going to invest in all these different capital stocks and is going to provide the labor to find output. I mean, there's also arrows going back, consumption and so on, but I didn't want to make this too crowded, so this is just the production side. So what I'm going to talk about first is these energy services. So I'm going to mean electrification is meaning the substitution between fossil fuels and electricity. That's the first thing I'm going to look at. And I'm going to look at the electricity factor and see what are the driving forces that determine electricity production. Okay, energy services. I have 5 data on motivating facts I'm going to show first. So firstly, we see that the electricity share since 1970, since data from 1970 to 2019, that the electricity share in final production place as energy inputs has doubled from around 10% to about 20%. Then the relative price of electricity has about halved. So relative means in comparison to fossil fuels. So we see there's a lot more variation here. I mean, in the 70s, we had 2 oil crises where the oil price spikes, which can be seen in here, and also then here the great financial crisis, when the oil price dropped. And that only goes to 2019, but in 2020 we will see another sharp drop here as well. Okay, so we see that the economy is kind of adjusting to this relative price change. So we're using more electricity relative to fossil fuels following the relative price change. But if we look at the expenditure share, it's actually quite staggering how stable they are. So even though there has been this price change, we see that the expenditure share over the whole 50 years has been relatively constant at about 2/3 for fossil fuels and 1/3 for electricity. Having said that, we see that in the short run, so on a year-to-year basis, basically these expenditure shares are very close to the relative prices, just detrended, right? So we know that constant expenditure shares tell us that we're living basically in a top-diverse world, right? There's a substitution should be relatively close to 1. But the changes from a year-to-year basis, kind of very strongly correlated with the relative price changes, tells us that we actually have a very low substitutability on the short run, right, on a year-to-year basis. And then if I put some structure in the model and estimate this CES of energy services from RE, which are going to be fossil fuels, use for final production and electricity, and some technology terms, and then the sigma E turns out to be 0.06, which is relatively close to once you on a yearly basis, but it's going to be close to 1 if you look at the one. Now, what we can do, or what I did, given this sigma E, you can actually back out these technology terms and see how these change over time. And what I find is that fossil fuels are relatively more productive. So if you, this is just plotting ARE over AV, and we see that over the last 50 years, fossil fuels have been more efficiently used in the economy. And to kind of replicate all these motivating or standard facts with a model, I'm going to rely on a directed technical change mechanism. So I'm keeping obviously the structure that I impose on the data as well, but instead of only having RE and V endogenously, I'm also allowing now the energy service producer to choose the AREs for the technology terms endogenously as well. And I'm allowing it to choose these technology terms along a technology frontier. So the intuition is going to be, I have two inputs. They're becoming, one of the inputs is becoming relatively more expensive. Substitutability is very low, so I can't just use more V vis-a-vis RE. But what I can do is I can invest in being better at using every drop of oil, every cubic meter of gas, and so on. And this technology frontier is exactly such that over the long run, or if I choose my technologies optimally along this frontier, I am effectively increasing my substitutability of these two inputs. Now, we don't want these adjustments, the technology adjustment to be too quick, right? Because otherwise we would be in a flat Leontief, in a Copernicus world the whole time. What we see that we want, or the key thing is to distinguish between short-run complementarity but long-run substitutability. And so I'm proposing some adjustment costs that mean, yes, I can choose my technology endogenously, but it's going to be costly to adjust these technologies, right? So I have to invest in getting new capital, new machines, for example, that run more efficiently on oils. Okay, and this is going to be the magic that happens in the model that's going to allow me to have, again, this complementarity in the short run, but more flexible economy in the long run.
Sorry, so the distinction here is the fossil fuel they use directly in production.
Exactly here. So as I've shown before, a fraction of fossil fuels is used directly in production, and a fraction, so about 2/3, 1/3, 1/3 is used to generate electricity first, and then through electricity is used. Okay, so this is what the problem looks like. We don't have to go through the details, but if we solve this, we can see that in a steady state we have exactly constant expenditure shares, even though we have this elasticity of substitution. So we get exactly what we want. And this data, which is the relative, the ratio of technologies, is behaving in, is adjusting according to this relative price. Showing the intuition before. Okay, just to see how well this model can match the data. Just here plotted the data again. We see the relative price change in the top left. We see the relative technologies that are backed out here, and the levels of use of fossil fuels and electricity, and the expenditure share in the bottom right. And if I just kind of plug in a series of prices. And so this is part of equilibrium, and we see that this model does a fairly good job at matching what we see in the data. So really the takeaway of this first part is electrification is happening. We can see some patterns in the data since the 1970s. Electricity and fossil fuels are strong complements in the short run, but much more substitutable in the long run. And there's a clear trend that is relatively more expensive input if become more efficiently used. And this partial equilibrium model of energy services, where you use the technology frontier from a different paper in a different context, can account for these things. Okay, so that was the first step. Now I want to take it to the general equilibrium setup. And yeah, as I said before, so final production is going to be relatively standard. There's a representative competitive competitive final output from the maximizes profit. And we have these three inputs: labor, capital, and energy circuit. Now, what's more interesting is to think about electricity production. And I'm setting up this problem to capture four main characteristics that are distinguishing the fossil and the green electricity. Firstly, it's going to, as I showed in the flowchart before, we have these two rely on specific capitals. So I can't just use a general capital stock in the economy and say you're now a solar panel and you're now a wind turbine. And I also can't just say that a coal-powered power plant can be readjusted to be a solar panel. So we need to have this, or we have two specific capitals as well as energy sources to generate this electricity. Then secondly, there's a different cost structure. So if we think about the marginal cost of producing another kilowatt hour of solar energy, it's going to be very low, because it's just as soon as you have a solar panel standing and the sun is shining, it's producing, right? But for fossil capital, it's different. So the fossil capital runs on fossil fuels, obviously. So for each unit of kilowatt hour that you're producing, you need some input of natural gas. So the marginal cost of fossil electricity is very much larger. Thirdly, there's going to be imperfect substitutability of these electricity types, because the sun might not always shine, the wind might not always blow. So there's intermittency problem. Then, for example, gas-powered power plants are much more able to provide a stable grid. So we always need to be at a grid frequency of 50 Hertz. It's super important, and fossil fuels are unfortunately much better at this. And then fourthly, we need to see how capital investment decisions are made. And there's going to be two things that are distinguishing these two types of capital. Firstly, green capital has a larger depreciation rate. So solar panels are going to run for about 20 years. You have fossil power plants going to run for 50, 60 years. And also construction costs. And I think that's worth looking at here as well. So what I'm plotting here, unfortunately, the data from the EIA is only since 2013. So what I'm plotting here is average construction cost for fossil and non-fossil generators. And you can see the orange line here, the non-fossil has dramatically decreased since 2013. It's kind of approaching the level of fossil construction fossil generators, which is very stable at around $1,000 per kilowatt. And the main driver of this decrease is that solar panels have become much cheaper over time. And obviously, this is going to influence my investment decisions. So for each kind of dollar, I'm now getting more kilowatts in solar panels now than I've done before. Okay, so this is formally the electricity producers problem. And then there's let me talk about the consumption factor first, which is relatively standard. I mean, so the consumer will have to be the one that is investing in all the different capital stocks. And here are these cues. So you can think of this decrease in construction cost of generators as some kind of investment-specific technological change. And he's going to supply labor inelastically. Just to simplify things. And when we look at kind of the market for fossil fuels, it's quite difficult to model it in a way that is simple but still captures the magnitudes of the data. I mean, we have OPEC, we have the US that are producing a lot of oil. So there's kind of a cartel with a competitive fringe and so on. So I'm gonna reduce this to a much simpler way. I'm going to say that price of the fossil fuels are going to depend on how much has already been extracted. So that's imposing a finite resource. So it's going to be kind of only a limited supply of oil left, but it's going to be more and more expensive to to find new oil fields, to drill deeper into the North Sea and so on to get to natural gas. So what we have here is that the cumulative resource use is, as I said before, what we've already extracted. And so this R is low use of fossil fuels, which is exactly what I use per period and as final input into production, and what I use to produce electricity. And this parameter here is going to be determining how convex this is, how quickly the price of fossil fuels is going to increase. And we might have some innovation here. So AR decreases, and we might have just found, oh, there's actually a new oil field nearby, and so there could be, so there are forces that are pushing PR up, and the long run trend is going to be the PR is increasing. But there's also forces that might push down on PR, especially if we're using less and less fossil fuels over time. What OPEC is going to do is they're going to decrease prices as traders, just to say, hey, you can have almost a free, please use some of our oil. And so as we're using less, we can see that also this price increase is going to decrease with that. Okay, so equilibrium results. I'm not going to talk about the definition, but I want to talk about briefly about the three main effects that are working here. So again, RB is the amount of fossil fuels that we're using to produce electricity. And in equilibrium, the demand for this is shaped by three main effects. Firstly, the energy service demand effects, which is just coming from final production. This is going to be a growing economy. So we're accumulating capital. There's going to be some exogenous technology change, labor augmenting. And as we're growing as an economy, we demand more energy, right? So we need more energy. And given that we're producing electricity with fossil fuels, there's also going to be a demand, increasing demand for this electricity, for this fossil fuel type. The second one is energy service composition effect. So as I'm increasing the electricity share, vis-a-vis the fossil fuel share in energy services, I'm increasing the demand for electricity, and given that electricity is produced also from fossil fuels, I'm also going to be demanding more RB. And then thirdly, the electricity composition effect. So the more I'm able to switch electricity production from fossil fuels to renewables, the more or the less RB I'm going to demand. And we can see that all these effects are driven by prices and technologies, which are going to be endogenous in the moment. Okay, let me have 1 minute quickly to explain the investment in electricity producing capital. As I said before, firstly, the relative interest rates of these two types of capital is going to be determined by the depreciation rates delta. So the higher delta for green capital, the less interesting it is for me as an investor, right? If I have to spend so much money and then next year the solar panel is broken, I'm not going to invest pretty much. Secondly, the Qs, which are shown before, which are just the cost per power plant, if you want. So if this relative costs are decreasing, also going to, so the relative energy rates are also decreasing. And then secondly, there's a dynamic effect. So this was T-1. There's also QGT showing up. So I as an investor look at, okay, so today solar panels are super expensive, but I know the trend says that it's going to be less expensive tomorrow, so I'm just going to wait until I buy the solar panel. So a decrease in Q is actually kind of an incentive for me as an investor to wait and kind of backload my investment. Okay, this is the intuition for the fossil fuels that are used directly as an energy input in final production. And if you've paid attention in color theory, so this is red, right? Yeah, and it was green before, which are complementary colors. And this means that this effect is actually the inverse of the effect that we had before. And the intuition is, again, RE is kind of competing with RD, because RD is producing electricity, and electricity is competing with both fuels and final production. So the more I'm electrifying, electrification is happening, and the less RE I'm using as a direct energy input. So the lower will be my demand for E. But the exact, yeah, sorry.
I just had a question. Do you have a sense of how restrictive the assumption of having a fixed substitution parameter is between some of these? So you can imagine, the grid gets super built out, and now there's much greater substitutability between, say, green versus fossil fuel, or at least electricity generation.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering how much that might affect the results of the model.
That's a good question. So that's the part that's still in the work. So I'm working on a way where I can endogenize these queues better. And there it's gonna, it's not fully finished yet, but there it's gonna the elasticity between these two power plants, if you want, is not going to play a big role. At the moment, it does play quite a bit of a role. But that's yeah, I'm still working. And I agree that in the limit it should be kind of whichever is more cheaply produced at the moment is going to be used, right? So it's going to be kind of almost perfect substitute with water. Yeah, working on that. I'll get back to you in a couple of months.
Yeah, 5 minutes.
I have 5 minutes. Yes. Okay. Thank you. Okay, then let me skip calibration. It's going to be too long, and just give you a sense of the quantitative results I have so far. So this is 50 years of laissez-faire. So let's just keep rolling as we are. There's no policy implemented. As I said before, we're a growing economy, so consumption is going to grow, output is going to grow, and services are going to grow, as it's going to be the demand for electricity. But as we can see here already, this is not the case for the two types of fossil fuel use. So you can see that RV, so fossil use for electricity production, is kind of starting to decrease right away. While RE, if I had plotted it for a longer time horizon, we would see that the peak for RE is around 2070, and then starts to decline as well. And let me skip forward for 1 second. And here is kind of the sum of the two. And we can see that even in laissez-faire, the energy transition is happening simply because of different effects that we've seen. We'll see that fossil fuels are becoming more expensive, so I want to substitute away from them. And green electricity is becoming much cheaper. So over time, while in the beginning, kind of these increasing effects, demand effects on fossil fuel are still dominating, over time we can see the price effect that will dominate. Are we actually going to have a transition without any cost? What we can also see is that this transition is super slow. So we want to be net zero by 2050. We have the peak at around, I don't know, mid-2030s. So we're never going to reach our fossil target. We just keep going against. Give me back 1 second. Again, just to have a look at the capital stocks. So at the moment, we see that fossil power plants are about 3 times in terms of megawatts, so generating capacity compared to green capital. But we see here again, especially because solar panels are becoming so much cheaper, and we have the different cost structure that the increasing price of fossil fuels is hammering down on fossil power plants. That around the early 2030s, we're actually going to have more generating capacity in greens than we have in fossil. So kind of a good news kind of situation that it's not that it's inevitable that the growing economy has to rely on fossil fuels, but just the transition is happening way too slowly. Okay, just to finish off maybe with the net zero by 2050 in the last 2 minutes. So the US has declared this as their goal. So by 2050, they want to be net zero, which requires 80% reduction in emissions compared to 1990. So for this policy experiment, I'm going to assume that this also requires 80% reduction in fossil fuel use. I mean, it's not very restrictive. We just know that coal is, for example, a bit more dirty than natural gas. Okay. But broadly speaking, this should hold. And so the restriction by 2050, lower or equal than 14.4 quadrillion BTUs, which sounds like an awful lot, but we're currently using about, sorry, a different scale, but 84, almost 85 quadrillion per year. And so these are the results. So the social planner is then looking at what's the least cost path to achieve net zero by 2050. And this is what the social planner comes up with, so blame him, not me. So we're going to see that there's a level as well as a growth effect. So we're still growing. So there's kind of this initial period where we get rid of all the fossil capital and buy new green capital. So very large investments in the initially, and then we're growing kind of. Yeah, okay, maybe it's out of time. The main message is that the growth rate is also decreasing, but we're about 1 percentage point lower growth rate than we had in the investment plan. Okay, on this, let me just say thank you very much. And